Hello everyone and welcome back. Today's lesson is going to be on the Antichrist, part 2, his rise. Our main text is going to be Daniel 7 and 8, and we're going to start with actually chapter 8. So let's go ahead and I'm going to share my screen with you. So go ahead and get your handout. Your handout's ready so that you can follow along. And bear with me while I pull this up. Okay, so this particular sequence of events that you see is going to be on the backdrop of all the pages for this lesson and next lesson. And the reason why is because this is the sequence of events according to Daniel chapter 8 and 7. And I believe that it actually lines up with our timeline that we did at the very beginning of the study. Matthew 24, and then also we're going to see it next week in Revelation itself. So, including the seals and the trumpets that we just went over, I believe they keep overlapping those same last 7 years of history. Possibly some of the birth pangs of Matthew 24, the beginning of labor pains could be before the ram and the goat that we're seeing at the beginning of Daniel chapter 8, but certainly some of it overlaps. Okay. All right, so I want to start by showing you from scripture the timestamp of when this starts, when this takes place. So if you would look in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 17. So he approached where I was standing. When he came near, I was terrified and fell face down. Son of man, he said to me, understand the vision refers to the time of the end. Okay, now verse 19. And I said, I am here to tell you what will happen at the conclusion of the time of wrath. Now that's interesting, isn't it? That means that by the time that this vision is complete, the time of God's wrath will be over. Okay? Let's keep reading. Because it refers to the appointed time of the end. So it says it 3 times. It's hard to kind of have any wiggle room with that, right? So then let's look over and see what are the last events of this vision. Okay, so let's go down and get Daniel chapter 8 and verse 14. He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored. So in the end of the sanctuary, at the end of the vision, the sanctuary is restored. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, let's look at the end of the vision's interpretation, which is in the same chapter. And we are going to look at verse 25. In the middle, I'll pick up at the middle, is talking about the Antichrist at this point, and we'll see that as we continue to study. Talking about the Antichrist, will destroy many in a time of peace. He will even stand against the prince of princes, yet he will be broken. So the Antichrist will be broken, but not by human hands. Okay, so the Antichrist is going to be broken by the end of this vision. So the sanctuary restored, the Antichrist broken, but not by human hands. It's the return of the king. The Antichrist will be destroyed by God himself when Jesus returns. All right, so now that we have a timestamp that this is going to be the last 7 years of history, literally the last 2,300 days of history. It just told us that in verse 14. So we can see this is the last, and let me explain that this 2,300 days is about 6+ years. It's not quite, it's like 145 days according to the Hebrew calendar, around about 145 days short of 7 years. Okay. Now the thing with the Hebrew calendar is that it fluctuates. They have leap years and stuff, so you're not going to know exactly, but right about that. Okay, so let's get started with Daniel chapter 8. We're going to read, I'll read the first part just to give us some context. Okay, so Daniel 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me earlier. I saw the vision, and as I watched, I was in the fortress of Susa, in the province of Elam. I saw in the vision that I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there was a ram standing beside the canal. It had 2 horns. Now, if you look up at the picture at the top of the PowerPoint, you're going to see on the right side, I have it saying ram. And on his head, you have 2 horns, okay? The 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other. See how I have one longer than the other? That's what that means. The longer one came up last. That's why I have it on the right side, because the way we read in English is from left to right. So the smaller kingdom or amount of power, reign, is first, and then an even bigger one at the end. Okay, the longer one came up last. Verse 4. I saw the ram charging to the west, the north, and the south. No animal could stand against him, and there was no rescue from his power. He did whatever he wanted and became great. So look back up at the PowerPoint, and you will see the arrows pointing north, west, and south. So those are the 3 directions that the ram is going to move. So now I want to show you in verse 20, this is the interpretation. So we are going to, in this particular study today, we're going to go back and forth between the vision and the interpretation of the vision. So I want you to see them side by side, each part, one right after the other, so that hopefully there will be more clarity and understanding what this all means. So verse 20 is the explanation of, and it's the only explanation in the interpretation about the ram. So verse 20, the 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. So if you look in history where Media and Persia are, it is Iran. So for the rest of this study, for the sake of clarity, I'm just going to call it Iran, okay? So it's that same area, okay? Now, let's fill in your blanks. We're going to go on the right side of the page. The area of Iran rises into power 2 times. The last is greater than the first. Point 2, it pushes north, west, and south. No one can stop it. Okay, so that's the first thing to happen in this last series of events. So whenever people ask me, you know, when they're looking at different end times events and they're like, oh, what do you think? What do you think? I'm always thinking the biggest story is the story that involves Iran pushing north, west, and south. And then also this next step that we're going to see with the goat. That's what I'm always looking for. Because once we see this event happen, along with the beginning of birth pangs, that is when we're going to start seeing that we're really in the last 7 years. So until this kicks it all off, I think it's too early to call it. But when we see this event that we just read and this next event we're about to read, then we can say, this is it, we're in the last 7 years, okay? And then in the weeks to come, we're gonna see what you can maybe do theologically and emotionally and even physically to prepare for that. Okay, so let's move on. This next section is going to be Daniel chapter 8, 5 through 8, and then we'll go on to the interpretation, which is 20 and 21, only about the goat. So this next section is the only section about the goat, okay? So let's keep reading. As I was observing, a male goat appeared, coming across the west coming from the west, coming from the west across the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. The goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and rushing at him with savage fury. I saw him approaching the ram, and infuriated with him, he struck the ram, breaking his two horns. So both of his horns are there, but one is even greater. So it seems like they're close together, these periods of this power that's grown with this Iranian area. Okay? Breaking both of the horns. The ram was not strong enough to stand against him. The goat threw him to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat acted even more arrogantly. So this goat figure, whoever this man is, was arrogant in the beginning, but after he annihilates the ram, he's even more arrogant. Okay? But when he became powerful, the large horn was broken. 4 conspicuous horns came up in its place, pointing towards the 4 winds of heaven. We'll get into those 4 later in the next part, okay, of this particular PowerPoint. But for this page, we're just going to stop right there and let's see if we can fill in some blanks. The first king of a nation to the west attacks Iran. The attack comes from across the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. Wow. Now let's look at the interpretation. So 20 and 21. The two-horned ram, we already talked about the two-horned ram. Verse 21, the shaggy goat represents the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes represents the first king. So I went and did some digging, and as it turns out, this king of Greece is a they did not do a good job when they translated it. It's a mistranslation. It is actually the king of Yavin, which is one of the descendants of Japheth that you can find in Genesis. So it's any king of Yavin. The reason why they put Greece is because there's a popular belief that says this has already happened. Even that belief, though, when you push them in a corner, they have to admit that certainly it's just a type and it hasn't actually happened because Jesus puts it in the future, okay? Jesus refers to something that happens here in with the little horn, which we're about to read about. Jesus puts the abomination of desolation still yet in the future in Matthew 24, which I've touched on a few times if you remember. Okay, so this king of Yavin is a singular that leads a plural. Okay, so let's keep reading. Verse 22 is going to touch on the 4 that come up, but we're just going to touch on it real quick and we'll come back to it. The 4 horns that took the place of the broken horn represent 4 kingdoms. They will rise from that nation, but without its power. So this horn right here, see this goat, how we have one horn in the middle? That is, I'm using that in this illustration to represent this king. So it's a first king of a nation. So it's a nation on the other side of the entire surface of the earth from where Iran is. And it's to the west. Okay? And it is a big enough nation, strong enough to wipe out Iran. So it's powerful, even more powerful than Iran. And it already talked about how powerful Iran was at this time. So that's something to consider. So in this particular nation, there's a first king that's a descendant of Yavin, one of Japheth's sons. Now Yavin, one of Yavin's descendants, did become the first king of Greece, but that is not what this is talking about, because our timestamp already said that this is the last 7 years of history, which absolutely has not occurred. And it's not been the end of God's wrath, has certainly not occurred. And this is not the appointed time of the end. That's definitely not occurred before Jesus even came. Certainly none of that could be true. So this vision refers to something still yet to come. All right. So Iran is completely destroyed by the goat. The king becomes even more arrogant when he becomes powerful. Then he is broken. So for a short time, this nation and this man become extremely powerful. But then he is broken. This man is broken. And that nation crumbles and it breaks apart. Okay? Okay. So let's move on. Now we're going to look at your moving down to the next section of your paper. We're going to look at the 4 that rise up next. Okay? We're going to look at Daniel 8, verse 8. Then the male goat acted even more arrogantly, but when he became powerful, the large horn was broken. 4 conspicuous horns came up in its place, pointing toward the 4 winds of heaven. All right, now we're going to look at verse 22. We've already read these, but we're going to look at 22 and 23. The 4 horns that took the place of the broken horn represented 4 kingdoms. They will rise from that nation. So they come from that same nation that just wiped out, that goat nation that was led by the goat, the son of Yavin. So a descendant of Yavin, who's a descendant of Japheth, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So a descendant of Japheth, a descendant of Yavin, is going to be the first king of a great nation that wipes out Iran, becomes great for a short time, and from that same nation comes 4, but they don't have the same amount of power. Okay, let's keep reading. They will rise from that nation, but without its power. Verse 23, near the end of their kingdoms, so these are kingdoms. These are 4 kingdoms of the earth. And we saw over in verse 8, the last section of verse 8 said pointing to the 4 winds of heaven. So they've spread out across the whole earth. It's become a global thing. Near the end, verse 23, near the end of their kingdoms, when the rebels have reached their full measure of their sin. So these are called rebels. These 4 are called by God rebels. Very interesting. So when their full measure of sin is complete, a ruthless king, skilled in intrigue, will come to the throne. And that's the Antichrist. So we're going to stop there because we just want to talk about these 4. Okay? And chapter 7 is going to give us more details. And I believe so will Revelation 13 and 17. And we're going to look at that next week. Okay? So it keeps overlapping and telling us more details as we go through scriptures. So let's go ahead and fill in these blanks. 4 kingdoms rise from that western kingdom, but they lack its power. These 4 point toward the 4 winds of heaven, so they spread out across the earth. Near the end of the 4 kingdoms, when the rebels are sin sick, a ruthless king will come. So I am showing you in this study what has to happen. What are we as Christians supposed to be watchful of? What are we supposed, we are commanded throughout the whole New Testament. Be watchful, be alert. Don't be taken like a thief. Don't be taken, what is a thief? When a thief comes to your house, they take you by surprise. We are not to be taken by surprise because we are not of the darkness or of the night. We are of the day. We are watchful and alert. How are we being watchful? Because we are looking at these events according to scripture and we are waiting. We are waiting for these things to happen along with the birth pangs. of Matthew 24, along with the seals, the first few seals, the four horsemen. And we're waiting for these things. We're waiting for Joel to start unfolding. And those things that we've already been over in the book of Joel. We're waiting for these things to start overlapping. And when we see all these things take place, then we can know, okay, we're in the last 7 years. I want you to know, I want you to come out of this study being for sure what those signs are. What are those things we're watching for? It's not just watching for like, well, I hope it hits me like a rock from the sky. I hope I just know. No, I don't want you to feel like that. I want you to know exactly from scripture, what are you waiting for? What are you watching for? What signs can you check a box and say, that's a sign according to scripture? Hey, that's the ram. And hey, it had two horns. It had two kingdoms, and the greater one came up last. And then it pushed north, west, and south. And then came a mighty nation from the west with a first king and wiped out Iran. And then came that they became great for a short time. But then that man was broken and divided up into four, which spread out around the world, but without his power. And they were full of sin, and they're called rebels. But when their full measure of sin is complete, oh, the one that comes up from that fourth nation, we'll learn that next in the next chapter, is actually the Antichrist. He rises up from this nation. So we are going to be able to spot the Antichrist and who he is, because look at all these things that have to happen first. Along with the birth pangs, along with the first four horsemen starting to occur. I don't know exactly where they overlap. Okay, but I believe they do. So let's keep going. All right, so now we're going to move to, if you're looking at your handout, this particular chapter, so Daniel chapter 8 talks about the ram and the goat, the first events to kick off the last 7 years. It talks about the four that come up, but it does not talk about the 10. It does then, it skips the 10, doesn't talk about them, but it talks about the Antichrist and his kingdom. Now you'll see in Daniel chapter 7, which we're about to go to after this, it doesn't talk about the ram and the goat. It talks about the 4, the 10, and then the Antichrist. Okay, so as you are looking throughout the different parts and passages in the Bible, throughout the Bible, it's going to mention different parts of this, but other parts it will leave out. Sometimes it will give more detail about a certain aspect of this last 7 years. Okay. All right, so let's keep reading. Now we're going to pick up in verse 9, and we're going to keep reading. Actually, let me look back up here. It looks like some of these are ones we've already covered. In 23, a ruthless king skilled in intrigue. Intrigue means plotting and manipulating. It actually also means the understanding of mysteries and secrets. Okay, his power will be great, but not his own. Okay, we'll keep reading to get the rest of these. Okay, so Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. From one of them, one of who? One of those four. Okay, one of those four kingdoms that we just were reading about. From one of them, a little horn emerged and grew exceedingly toward the south and the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew as high as the heavenly army, made some of the army and some of the stars fall to the earth and trampled them. It acted arrogantly, even against the prince of the heavenly army. It revoked its regular sacrifice and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. In the rebellion, the army was given up together with the regular sacrifice. The horn threw truth to the ground and was successful in what it did. Then I heard, we're going to stop right there. Okay. Now let's go to verse 24. This is the interpretation. We just learned about the ruthless king in 23. A ruthless king, skilled in intrigue, will come to the throne. Verse 24, his power will be great, but it will not be his own. He will cause outrageous destruction and succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the powerful along with the holy people. Now, that is an important point to remember. The Antichrist is going to destroy the powerful people on the earth. And we know in Revelation, we're going to see in Revelation 17, that he, along with those 10 kings, destroy Babylon. The leaders and the nobles of the earth are going to be killed by the Antichrist, and along with the holy people. That's the saints. And we already learned about how he's going to be killing the saints. That's us. Verse 25, he will cause deceit to prosper through his cunning and by his influence, and in his own mind he will exalt himself. He will destroy many in a time of peace. He will even stand against the prince of princes, yet he'll be broken, but not by human hands. Okay, let's fill in these blanks. He will be cunning and have great influence. He will cause lies to prosper. He exalts himself, and we know from other passages that he exalts himself as God himself. He will destroy many in a time of peace. Okay? He will stand against the prince. Okay, now this is actually a really important thing that I want to pull out. This part, there's certainly different people who have different ideas about this that I think are certainly worth listening to and hearing their opinions on this. But I'm going to show you what I think the prince is. And so let me show you Daniel chapter 10, verse 13. So it's the same book. We're still in the book of Daniel, so it's in the same context. Verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me after I had been left there with the kings of Persia. So this is when one of the angels is he's been told by God to go and give Daniel an explanation to one of his visions. And the angel is trying to get to Daniel to give him the interpretation. And another angel, but a fallen angel, opposes him, and he cannot get into Daniel. And it was many days in which he was trying to fight to get in. So there is a spiritual realm, and there are fights going around. Okay? They're going on. We just can't see them with our eyes. And so it's funny to me that Daniel very much likes to refer to the angels as princes. But it's very true. This is what he seems to keep on calling them. He calls Michael a prince. He calls this evil angel, this fallen angel, the prince of Persia. Okay? And then let's look in verse 21. However, I will tell you what is recorded in the book of truth. No one has the courage to support me against those princes, talking about fallen angels, except Michael, your prince. Okay, so Michael is again called a prince. He was called the chief prince. Now he's called a prince again. Now turn to Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands watch over your people, will rise up. Okay, so Michael watches over the Israelites. It's one of his jobs, Michael the archangel. All right, now I want you to turn to 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of context, so we're going to skip around a little bit. Now, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask that you, brothers and sisters, do not be easily upset or troubled either by a prophecy or by a message or a letter supposedly from us, alleging that the day of the Lord has come. Okay, so he goes on talking about the day of the Lord and what's going to happen before the day of the Lord. Now, verse 5. Don't you remember that when I was still with you, I used to tell you about this? Verse 6. And you know what currently restrains him, the lawless one, because the lawless one was just discussed in verse 3. If you go back and read that later. So him is the lawless one, the Antichrist. So he will be revealed in his time. Verse 7. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but the one now restraining, so it's a being now restraining, will do so until he is out of the way. So he, the one restraining, is going to be out of the way at some point. And verse 8, and then the lawless one will be revealed. The Lord will destroy him with the breath of his mouth and will bring him to nothing at the appearance of his coming. So the Antichrist will be destroyed at the Lord's coming. Okay? And so what is going to take place, we just read, is that the lawless one is not going to be revealed until someone, a being, is moved out of the way. Okay? All right, so I read to you Daniel. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands watch over your people, will rise up. So I would propose that the one that's doing the restraining is actually Michael, and that he watches over, he is the prince, the chief prince, and that he watches over Israel, and he is going to move out of the way. Now I'm going to show you in Revelation chapter 12 when I think this happens. Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels also fought, but he could not prevail, and there was no place for them in heaven any longer. So I propose that perhaps it actually happens here. I don't know that for sure, but I have a hunch that maybe that's what this is talking about, that Michael and Satan are having a fight along with the fallen angels, and Michael moves out of the way. So I would propose that he is that restrainer. So let's get back to Daniel chapter 8. Okay. Okay, let's fill in our blanks. So he will stand against the prince. He will revoke the regular sacrifice. He will overthrow the place where the sanctuary is. And from Iran rising in power to the sanctuary being restored, there is 2,300 days, and that's 6+ years. It's about 185 days short of 7 years. Sorry, I think I said before 145, but it's actually 185. Okay, all right, so hopefully that has given you a bit more understanding about the way the Antichrist comes to power. Now let's go ahead and look at Daniel chapter 7. And looking back at this sheet, Daniel chapter 7, remember, does not talk about the ram and the goat situation. It picks up at those 4. Okay, so we're going to zoom in on those 4 that rise up after the goat is destroyed. So let's go to Daniel chapter 7, and we're going to pick up at verse 4. Actually, I'm going to pick up at verse 3. 4 huge beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Verse 4. The first one was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted from the ground and set on its feet like a man and given a human mind. Verse 5. Suddenly another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side and with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and gorge yourself on flesh. Verse 6, after this I was watching, and suddenly another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. It had 4 heads. Remember the 4 heads. And it was given dominion. So now this one has dominion. Verse 7, after this, while I was watching in the night vision, suddenly a 4th beast appeared, frightening and dreadful and incredibly strong, with large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled with its feet whatever was left. So whatever those first 3 did not devour and crush, this 4th beast finishes the job. Okay? It was different from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. So the 10 horns are going to be these 10 kings here. We're going to see that, but I'm just showing you as we go through the text. Okay. Let's go ahead and fill in some blanks. Okay. So the first one is like a lion with eagle's wings. The wings are torn off, and he's given a human mind. The bear is raised up on one side. He's told to gorge on flesh. Okay. So slaughter is occurring. Interesting. All right. The second one is like a leopard. Okay. It's given dominion. Sorry, this is the third one, the leopard. The leopard has dominion and it has 4 heads. The fourth beast is different from the others. It's terrifying and dreadful, strong. 10 kings come up from this kingdom. Their kingdom will devour the whole earth and trample it down and crush it. So we're going to look at the interpretation. Now, just like in Daniel chapter 8, this Daniel chapter 7 has the vision and then the interpretation of the vision. So we're going to go look at Daniel chapter 19, Daniel chapter 7, verse 19, verse 23, and verse 24. And we're going to see what the interpretation says about these 4. All right, so verse 19. Then I wanted to be clear about the fourth beast, the one different from all the others, extremely terrifying, with iron teeth and bronze claws, devouring, crushing, and trampling with its feet whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns. Okay. Let's look back at verse 17 too, because it mentions them. Verse 17, these huge beasts, 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise up from the earth. Okay, so that's important to know, is that these are kings. Okay. So there we have the explanation that these 4 are actually 4 kings. All right, and they're kingdoms because they're going to be called kingdoms as well. So kings with kingdoms. All right, so let's read verse 23. This is what he said. The fourth beast will be a 4th kingdom on the earth, different from all the other kingdoms. It will devour the whole earth, trample it down, and crush it. Okay, verse 24. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will rise from this kingdom, the 4th one. So from the 4th kingdom comes 10 kings. Another king, different from the previous ones, will rise from among them and subdue 3. So we'll just pause right there because that's talking about the Antichrist coming. Okay, so this is where we get that. Now we're going to move on to the 10 kings, and let's zoom in and examine these 10 kings. I'm going to move myself over a little so you can see. All right, so we're going to look. We just looked at, actually, we just already read that. The 10 kings will rise from the 4th kingdom. 3 kings will become uprooted by the Antichrist. So when the Antichrist comes, he's going to come up from among, or the word is between or among these 10, but he's different than these 10. Okay. All right. Okay. So now let's keep going, and we're going to read verse 25. This is still talking about the Antichrist. He has just subdued the 3. That's why if you look up at the top of the PowerPoint, you see there's 10 little guys. Well, the 3 on the right are kind of separated because when the Antichrist comes, 3 are subdued. 3 of these kings are in some way, uprooted. Okay, verse 25. He, the Antichrist, will speak words against the Most High and oppose the holy ones of the Most High. That's the saints, the Christians. He will intend to change religious festivals and laws. And the holy ones will be handed over to him for time, and half a time. So that's 3.5 years. Time, times, that's 2 years. And then half a time, so 3.5 years. Okay, and that's going to be discussed next week in more detail. It's going to say that again. It's going to say 42 months, which is exactly 3.5 years. Okay, that's the amount of time that the Great Tribulation happens. The Antichrist will persecute the church, the Christians, for 3.5 years. Okay. Verse 26. But the court will convene, and his dominion, that's the Antichrist dominion, will be taken away to be completely destroyed forever. The kingdom, the dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under all of heaven will be given to the people, the holy ones of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will serve and obey him. So that is great news, because the side that we are on, even though we're getting killed and persecuted and captured and plundered, our side wins in the end. So that is great news, isn't it? So, all right. So let me make sure that we have finished. Let's see. 3 Kings. Here we go. Okay, so the little horn, or the Antichrist, comes from among the 10 kings. The Antichrist speaks arrogantly against the Most High. That's the abomination of desolation, happens at that time. When you look back at that, I want you guys to, let's zoom in on that a little bit. I want to look at it. So, Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. While I was considering the horns, suddenly another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. And suddenly, in this little horn, there were eyes like the eyes of a human, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. So, this is the Antichrist and the abomination of desolation. Okay, he will be different from the other 10 kings, and rises after they do. So the 10 kings comes first. Okay. Point 5. The little horn will wage war against and prevail over the Christians. He will oppress them and wear them out. That's what the word means, oppress, to oppress them. The Christians are handed over to the Antichrist for 3.5 years. And those are the verses that we just read. The Antichrist will intend to change religious festivals and laws. Very interesting. That was in verse 25. The Antichrist and his kingdom will be defeated by the Ancient of Days, and the 3 other kingdoms will lose their dominion, yet they will live on for a time. So I'm going to show you that. That is in chapter 7. Well, it starts at verse 9. It's so good. It talks about the Ancient of Days coming, but you can read that later. I'm going to pick up at verse 10. A river of fire was flowing, coming out of his presence. Is talking about the Ancient of Days. So Jesus is sitting on the throne. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was convened, and the books were open. Now, I just have to show you how this actually matches up with Revelation chapter 20, verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne, and the one seated on it, and the earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. I also saw the dead, and the great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. That's where the Christians' names are. Those who stopped believing in themselves and believe in Jesus only. They've humbled themselves before God. And the dead were judged according to their works by what was written in the books. So if you are judged by the books, plural, you're going to the lake of fire. So if you trust in yourself, your own works, which is what everyone does, every single person believes either in their own works or in Jesus's work. If you believe in Jesus's work on the cross, his death, his burial, and his resurrection in your place. If you believe in Jesus, your name is in the book, singular, the book of life. If your name is not in the book, then you will be judged by the books, plural. And in those books are written all of your deeds, all of your thoughts, all of your actions, and everything has been written down. We've all been being watched. We're already caught. Okay? And the dead were judged according to their works by what was written in the books. Verse 13, then the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. So that means all people that have died before will be raised at this time. This is the resurrection of the dead. Each one was judged according to their works. These are the dead. These are those that have not trusted in Jesus Christ, God's Son. They have not humbled themselves before God. Verse 14, death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Remember that Jesus did not come to save us from the first death. The first death, we're all going to die. The first death, that's separation from your soul and spirit from your body. Everyone that's not raptured, the only ones that won't experience that will be the ones that are raptured, the saints that make it to the rapture. So this second death, this is called, right here, the next thing, the lake of fire. Verse 15, and anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life, the book, singular, was thrown into the lake of fire. So everyone who's trusting in their own works, plural, is going to the lake of fire. Because their trust is in something imperfect that is not good. Good means perfect, without any amount of bad. None of us even come close to that. We do not bear the image of God correctly at all, not even close. So that is what this is referring to. Verse 10 of Daniel 7. The court was convened and the books were open. The books, plural, is what the dead that are not saved, they have not trusted Jesus as their Savior. They're trusting themselves and their own works as their Savior, and their works will lack. They will be wanton. It will not work. Verse 11, I watched then, because the sound of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking, this is the Antichrist, as I continued watching, the beast, that's the Antichrist, was killed and its body destroyed and given over to the burning flame, burning fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, so that's the other three beasts, right, that we just heard about, these four right here, okay, their dominion was removed, so they don't have dominion anymore, but an extension of life was granted to them for a certain period of time. I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like the Son of Man was coming on the clouds of heaven. And of course, it goes on. It talks about Jesus setting up his kingdom. It's an everlasting kingdom that will never be destroyed. And it's a wonderful, beautiful passage. Go back and read that. Okay, so we see that the Antichrist is destroyed at the coming of the Ancient of Days. And we have that judgment, that same last judgment that same judgment that's right there in Revelation that we just read. Okay, so I wanted to point out, it's important for us to all notice that these other three kingdoms are actually still there. They're still present at the return of the king. And that's an important point. I actually, it took me back a little bit, because I was thinking that these four had to be the globalist elite, and that the Antichrist destroys them. But I would propose that even though these are around during the last 7 years of history, the same time as the globalist elite, these are just the kingdoms or regions and some of the kings that are there. But they are, although they might be coinciding, it would seem as though the Antichrist might expose the religious system, and some of this system is exposed by the Antichrist, and the city of Babylon is going to be destroyed. We'll see that next week. So that city is going to be destroyed, and the religious system, this global religious system, is going to be destroyed. We're going to see that next week. But the regions of dominion, although their dominion will be taken away, those regions where the dominion was being had are given an extension of life there when Jesus comes. Now, I don't know how long that extension of life is. Maybe it's just during the time when people are being judged. Maybe that's what it is, when God judges the nations. But so even though these are happening at the same time, and these are global, these beasts are global, and they're crushing and tearing down and completely just really mistreating the people of the earth. And it seems like just the whole earth is completely crushed and trampled down. This is not completely coinciding with Babylon, although it's during the same time period, and they might be a little bit interwoven. It's maybe divided into, maybe one is political and one is religious. I'm not sure. Babylon itself is certainly extremely religious. And the Bible will hash that out over and over. So, but I want us to kind of realize that even though these are happening at the same time, and they might be using each other for power and vying for power, and they're doing the same things together, they're crushing and bringing down and subduing and having complete dominance over the whole world, there's only one aspect of it that the Antichrist exposes. The others, in part, are somehow allowed to still be there until the Messiah comes, and then he takes away their dominion. So important to see, and that could have something to do with the system that is in power. We know that for the seals, which we already went over, that the economy is completely taken over, globally, and there's the slaughtering and the subduing and the conquering and stuff like that. So if that coincides with this, it would seem like that system that's in place might be what's being talked about, and the Antichrist continues to use that system, even though he exposes the main city center, and he exposes aspects of it, especially the religious aspect and the sexual immorality aspect and the merchants and a lot of the buying and selling. He's going to expose the corruption that's involved there. So certain aspects will be destroyed and exposed, but then other aspects will still be in play until Jesus gets there. So hopefully, I hope that from looking into all of this, that this helps to bring clarity as to what's going to happen in the last 7 years of history. And then next week, we're going to be looking at the Antichrist Part 3, his reign, and we're going to be looking at Revelation and what the Antichrist specifically is going to do when he's in power, what he's going to do when he's reigning on the earth for those especially 3.5 years, if not a little more than that. We just know for sure he has complete dominion for 3.5 years. Okay, well, thank you very much for being a part of this study. Look forward to seeing you next time.